There is a small town in northeastern France called Pont-à-Mousson. If you were to visit it today, you would find a quiet place along the Moselle River, cobblestone streets, an old market square, a church whose stone walls have stood for centuries. Tourists pass through sometimes. Children play near the water. The river moves along as it always has, indifferent to what happened on its banks in the autumn of 1944. But if you were to stand on the western bank of that river and look east toward the ridgeline above the town, and if you knew what to look for, you might begin to understand why a group of German marksmen, some of the most highly trained riflemen in the world, found themselves in those weeks of September and October making the same fatal miscalculation again and again. They were watching the Americans, and they had been watching them for days. They had studied the ground, calculated the distances, and prepared their positions with the precision their training demanded. By every measure they understood, they were ready. What they were not ready for was the way those Americans moved. The question this story will answer is not about marksmanship or rifle ranges or the technical superiority of one army's equipment over another's. It is a quieter question than that. It is this: what happens when a military doctrine built on certainty encounters men who have been taught to trust nothing, not the map, not the plan, not even the ground beneath their feet, except the judgment of the man beside them and the instinct they have spent months learning to sharpen. His name was Corporal Raymond J. Holt, and he was 23 years old in the autumn of 1944, though the men in his squad would have told you he sometimes seemed older than that, and sometimes seemed much younger, depending on the day and the light. He had grown up in a small town in southern Ohio called Waverly, a place of roughly 6,000 people, set between low hills and the Scioto River, the kind of town where everyone knew whose truck was parked outside, whose house, and what that probably meant. His father worked at a hardware store on the main street. His mother kept a garden behind their house, tomatoes and green beans mostly, and she canned everything in August so the family would have it through the winter. Raymond was the second of 4 children. He had played baseball in high school, not well enough to be proud of it, he always said, but well enough to enjoy it. And he had worked summers at the grain elevator outside of town before the draft notice arrived in the spring of 1943. He was not a man who had thought much about Europe before the war. He could find France on a map, more or less. He knew Germany had started the fighting. He knew his country had been pulled in. These were sufficient facts for a young man from Waverly, Ohio, who had never been farther east than Columbus. By September of 1944, however, Raymond Holt knew considerably more than that. He had come ashore in Normandy in July, had moved across the French countryside with the 3rd United States Army, the force commanded by General George S. Patton, and had seen enough of Europe by now to understand that the war was not going to end conveniently or soon. And he was assigned to a rifle squad within the 90th Infantry Division, which had been operating as part of Patton's 3rd Army since the breakout from Normandy. The 90th had earned a difficult reputation early in its combat service. It had struggled in its first weeks in France, changed commanders twice, and suffered considerable casualties before it found its footing. By the time Raymond's squad reached the Moselle River Valley in September, the division had hardened considerably. The men who had survived the summer were not the same men who had landed in June. They had learned things that cannot be taught in any training camp. And the primary lesson was this: the plan is a starting point, not a guarantee. It is worth taking a moment to explain why the Moselle River mattered so much in the autumn of 1944. Because the geography shaped everything that followed. And it is easy to look at a map without truly understanding what that ground meant to the men who had to cross it. The Moselle runs roughly north and south through northeastern France and into Germany. In this section of the river, near Pont-à-Mousson, the water is not particularly wide, perhaps 150 yards at most. But the banks are steep in places, the current is strong, and the eastern side of the river rises quickly into high ground. That high ground was the problem. Any force crossing from west to east would be exposed during the crossing, and once across would face the necessity of climbing toward an enemy that held the ridge line and could see everything below. To the German defenders, the Moselle was an excellent defensive position. Their units had been falling back across France since August, and they needed time to reorganize, time to bring up reinforcements, time to prepare the fortifications that lined the German border some miles to the east. Holding the Moselle, even temporarily, could buy them weeks. Their commanders understood this clearly, and they had positioned their forces accordingly. Among those German defensive forces were elements of a specialized unit, trained riflemen and observers whose job was not simply to shoot at the Americans, but to watch them, to study their movement patterns, and to anticipate where they would be. In the vocabulary of modern military analysis, these men were attempting to identify what is sometimes called a pattern of life, the predictable behaviors that any unit develops over time, and the habits of movement that become so routine the soldiers themselves stop noticing them. This is what the German snipers and forward observers had been doing for days before the crossing. They had watched earlier American units move. They had noted the patterns. Americans, they had observed, tended to use roads when roads were available. They moved in recognizable formations. They paused at predictable intervals. When terrain offered two routes, one exposed, one more sheltered, they generally chose the more sheltered one, which made the sheltered approaches predictable. When scouts went forward, the main body followed within a certain distance and a certain time. These observations were not wrong exactly. They had been true, but they had been gathered watching other units at other times in other places, and they had been gathered watching an army that was still learning. And in the headquarters of one German regimental commander, whose name appears in the division's captured records as Oberst Friedrich Wenger, a career officer of the old school who had served in Poland and Russia before being posted to France. There is a document dated the 12th of September, 1944, which records his assessment of the American threat to his section of the river. The assessment is calm, professional, and almost entirely confident. The Americans, Wenger wrote, would cross at the most logical point. They would follow the road network. They would advance on the schedule their previous movements had suggested. His men were positioned to receive them. He was not a foolish man. He was a man whose confidence was built on real evidence. That is what made the weeks ahead so costly for the forces under his command. Raymond Holt and his squad received their orders on the evening of the 13th of September. They were to be part of a crossing effort several miles south of where the Germans expected the main American effort to fall. The objective was a set of low heights on the eastern bank. a cluster of farm buildings and stone walls that commanded a clear view of the road leading east toward the German border. If that ground could be taken and held, American artillery observers could be placed there, and those observers could direct fire across a considerable stretch of the German defensive line. The plan, as explained to Raymond's platoon leader, a first lieutenant named Cooper from Tennessee, was straightforward. Cross the river before dawn and move up the eastern slope under cover of darkness. Reach the farm buildings and secure them before the German defenders could respond in force. Hold until the main crossing began later that morning and reinforcements could follow. It was, as such plans went, a reasonable one. The intelligence estimate suggested the farm was held by a small security element, perhaps a dozen men, possibly fewer, with no artillery support immediately at hand. The approach route had been studied. The timing had been calculated. Everything that could be known had been considered. Everything, that is, except what the ground actually looked like when you were standing on it in the dark. Raymond checked his rifle one final time that evening, wrapped his feet in the dry socks his mother had sent in her last package. She always sent 2 pairs, always wool, because she had heard somewhere that wet feet were a soldier's first enemy, and sat for a while against a stone wall with a man named Eddie Shemansky, a 20-year-old from Milwaukee who was the youngest man in the squad and who had not yet learned to hide his nervousness as well as the older men had. "You think the farm is really as empty as they said?" Eddie asked. Raymond looked at the dark line of the ridgeline across the river. "It might be," he said. He did not say what he was thinking, which was that things were rarely exactly as they said. They crossed before 3 in the morning. The river was cold, and the current pulled at their legs with a persistence that suggested it had someplace more important to be. They went over on a light assault raft, 6 men at a time, our paddles keeping them from being swept too far downstream, and they did it twice, crossing and recrossing until all 12 members of the squad were on the eastern bank, crouched in the darkness among the reeds and the mud. Lieutenant Cooper had them moving within 4 minutes of the last man coming ashore. This was deliberate. The longer you stayed still at a river crossing, the longer the enemy had to find you before you had found any cover worth having. The slope rose gradually at first, then more steeply. The ground was wet from recent rain, which muffled their movement somewhat, but made footing uncertain. Raymond moved near the front of the column, behind the 2 scouts who were working 20 yards ahead. He had learned by now to notice things at night without being entirely sure what he was noticing. A quality of stillness, a particular texture of shadow, the absence of a sound that ought to have been there. It was the absence of sound that first told him something was different. There should have been animals. A farm in this part of France, even in wartime, would have had chickens at minimum, and possibly cattle. The smell of livestock and the small sounds they make, that low, intermittent shuffling and breath that is the natural voice of a barnyard at rest, these things should have been present long before the buildings came into view. There was nothing. The night was silent in a way that felt deliberate. He said nothing yet. It might have been nothing. Animals were moved. Farms were abandoned. There were 100 explanations for silence. They reached the upper edge of the slope, where a stone wall separated the open hillside from the farm's outer yard, and here the first scout paused and held up a fist, the signal to stop and hold. Raymond lowered himself to one knee and waited. The scout eased back to Lieutenant Cooper, and Raymond, watching from nearby, could see the shape of a whispered conversation, the slight shaking of a head. Something had been seen, or heard, or noticed. The lieutenant moved forward himself and looked for a long moment. Then he came back and crouched beside Raymond. "There's a vehicle behind the barn," he said quietly. "A half-track. Intelligence didn't mention a half-track." Raymond looked at the stone wall and the darkness beyond it. A half-track was an armored vehicle, heavier than a truck, capable of carrying soldiers or weapons, and most importantly, and not something you parked at a position that was held by a dozen men on light security duty. A half-track belonged to a unit that was prepared to fight or to move in force. "How many do you think?" Raymond asked. The lieutenant didn't answer right away. He was working through the same arithmetic. They had been told the position was lightly held. The half-track suggested otherwise. The question was how far otherwise. They were still working through that question when the radio crackled. A communications runner had stayed with the crossing equipment, maintaining their link to the battalion headquarters on the western bank. The message that came through was from the operations officer, a major whose voice Raymond had heard before, but never in a tone quite like this one. New orders, and the timing of the main crossing had been moved up by 2 hours to coincide with an artillery preparation that had been arranged with a neighboring unit to the north. The farm position needed to be in American hands, confirmed, secured, and signaled by 5:30 in the morning, not by 7. The regiment was counting on it. It was now approximately 4:15. Raymond watched Lieutenant Cooper hold the radio handset and look at the stone wall and the half-track beyond it and do the mathematics that every officer in a situation like this one has to do. Headquarters wanted confirmation by 5:30. It was 45 minutes away. The position in front of them was larger than anyone had thought. His men were tired, cold, and carrying only what they had brought across the river. The lieutenant handed the radio back to the runner and was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to his squad leaders. "We're going in," he said. "We move on 3 sides at once. No artillery. We're too close, and we can't risk alerting them before we're inside the wall. We use what we have." This was the decision that every set of orders, from every headquarters, in every war, eventually produces. The moment when the plan created miles away meets the ground as it actually is, and the man on the ground has to choose between obeying the plan and obeying the situation. Lieutenant Cooper was not a reckless man. He was a careful man who had been given 2 incompatible facts and was doing his best to honor them both. They moved at 4:23. What happened next took approximately 4 minutes, though Raymond would later be unable to say with confidence whether it was more or less than that. What he could say with complete precision was what he heard first, not the crack of a rifle, not an explosion. What he heard first was the sound of a heavy wooden door opening on its hinges somewhere in the darkness ahead of him. A long, slow creak, entirely ordinary, entirely domestic. And then a voice, speaking German, not shouting, simply speaking in the normal tone of a man saying something to someone nearby. And then every weapon in that farmyard opened at once. Raymond was behind the wall when it started. The wall was stone, perhaps 2 feet thick, and it stopped most of what was aimed at him. He pressed himself against it, and felt the vibration of rounds striking the other side, and understood in some deep, a wordless way that the number of weapons firing at them was considerably more than a dozen. When the initial volley found no clear targets, because Raymond's squad had already gone to cover, there was a pause of perhaps 3 seconds. Raymond counted the barrel flashes he could see over the top of the wall. He counted 7 before he stopped counting and dropped back down. 7 firing positions that he could see. The buildings had more walls and more angles than 7. The German position was not a light security element. It was a reinforced company, somewhere between 80 and 120 men, based on the weight of fire, dug into the farm buildings and the surrounding walls with prepared fields of fire that covered every approach the intelligence assessment had considered most likely. They had been waiting. The intelligence had not been deliberately wrong. It had been gathered from a different point in time, when the position had indeed been lightly held. But in the 3 days since that estimate had been prepared, the Germans had moved a full company forward into exactly this position, anticipating correctly that the Americans would identify the farm's value as an observation point and would try to take it. What they had not anticipated was that the Americans would come as early, as quietly, or from the precise angle they had chosen. This was the first crack in Oberst Wenger's calculations. His reinforced position had been designed to catch Americans moving along the road and up the main slope. Raymond's squad had come up the northern edge of the hill, along a route that offered no cover and no obvious tactical value, which was precisely why the German defensive plan had left it less heavily covered. Raymond crawled along the base of the wall to where Lieutenant Cooper was lying flat, speaking into the radio in a voice he was fighting to keep level. The answer coming back from the battalion was not encouraging. The main crossing was committed. The artillery preparation had been arranged. There was no reserve to send across before 5:30. The squad would need to hold where it was. Eddie Szymanski was next to Raymond when the first of their number went down. His name was Corporal Frank Okafor, a quiet man from Detroit who had worked in an automobile plant before the war and who kept a photograph of his daughter in the left breast pocket of his jacket over his heart. He was struck in the shoulder by a round that came through a gap in the wall he hadn't seen in the dark. He did not make a great deal of noise. He pressed his hand against the wound and said something very quietly that Raymond could not hear. And then Raymond was beside him, applying the field dressing from his own kit, because Frank had used his own kit on another man 3 weeks earlier and hadn't been resupplied. "It's all right," Frank said, though he was speaking mostly to himself, Raymond thought. Frank would survive. He would lose some use of the arm, and he would spend 8 months in a military hospital before being sent home to his daughter and his wife and his city. But in that moment, in the dark against a stone wall in France, with the firing still going on around them, Raymond did not know any of that. And he only knew that a man he had moved across the ground with for 11 months was bleeding and could not fight, and they were running low on ammunition, and there was no one coming to help them before 5:30 in the morning. He looked at his watch. It was 4:51. For the men who held that ground in those 40 minutes, a like on this video cost nothing. For them, it was everything. The shooting had settled into an intermittent exchange, neither side pressing, both sides waiting. The Germans had the numbers and the prepared position. Raymond's squad had the stone wall and the darkness. As long as neither moved, The mathematics remained unresolved. It was in this stillness that Raymond began to think. This is worth pausing to understand, because it is central to what actually happened that morning, and it is the thing the German defenders across the wall had not accounted for. They had prepared for American aggression. They had prepared for American firepower. They had prepared for the predictable approaches their experience had told them to expect. What they had not prepared for was an American corporal pressed against a stone wall in the dark, doing something that looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. He was thinking. General George S. Patton had a reputation in the newspapers of the time and in the popular memory that followed as a man of furious action, a commander who pushed forward when others hesitated, who drove his armies faster than any logistician believed possible, who was impatient with caution and contemptuous of delay. This reputation was not wrong exactly, but it was incomplete. Yet Patton had spent his career studying warfare in a way that few of his contemporaries had matched. He had read military history in 4 languages. He had studied not just the great battles, but the decisions that preceded them, the thinking that shaped them. And one of the ideas he returned to most consistently, in his letters, in his lectures, in the training orders he issued to his Third Army, was this: when the direct approach is blocked, the enemy has done you a favor. He has told you exactly where he expects you to be. Go somewhere else. He expressed this in various ways at various times, but the clearest statement of the principle appeared in a training memorandum he issued in August of 1944, which was read to unit commanders and filtered down through the chain of command in the weeks that followed. Fixed fortifications are monuments to man's stupidity. If we must make a choice, let us always choose to attack where the enemy is not, rather than where he is. Raymond Holt had not read that memorandum. He was a corporal, not an officer. But he had listened to Lieutenant Cooper over 11 months in the field, and Lieutenant Cooper had listened to his battalion commander, and his battalion commander had listened to Patton's commanders, and somewhere in that chain of transmission, the idea had settled into the practical vocabulary of how the 90th Division's soldiers thought about obstacles. When something is blocked, you find the edge of the block. Raymond looked at the wall to his left. It ran for perhaps 40 yards before it met the corner of the main barn. Beyond the barn, he could see, or thought he could see, the edge of the slope descending into a narrow orchard. The trees bare enough in September to provide some cover, but not much. The German position had its heaviest concentration at the front of the farm, facing the main slope. The side facing the orchard was different. He had seen fewer muzzle flashes from that direction. He crawled to Lieutenant Cooper and laid it out quietly. Not as a plan, he did not presume to offer plans to the lieutenant, but as an observation. There are fewer of them on the orchard side. If 3 men could get through the orchard to the barn's far corner, they could be behind the main defensive position, not to overrun it. That was not possible with the numbers they had, but to create a problem for the defenders that they would have to turn to address, which would mean turning away from the wall where the rest of the squad was. The lieutenant listened. He looked at the orchard. He thought for a moment. "The orchard has a farmhouse," he said, "on the far side." Raymond had not seen that in the dark. "Someone might be in it," the lieutenant said. This was not a small consideration. The farmhouse, if it was occupied, might contain the family who worked this land, an old man, a woman, children who had had nowhere else to go when the war arrived in their yard. Moving through the orchard meant moving close to that house, possibly drawing fire toward it, possibly catching its inhabitants in a situation they had not chosen and could not escape. Both men were quiet with this for a moment. Lieutenant Cooper made his decision slowly. He was a careful man. "We go around the far edge of the orchard," he said. "We keep as much distance from the house as the ground allows. If anyone is inside, they're already keeping their heads down. We don't change that, if we can help it." He sent Private Novak, a wiry young man from Minnesota, who moved more quietly than anyone else in the squad, to check the near edge of the orchard before they committed. Novak was back in 4 minutes. "There's a light in the lower window," he said. "A candle. Someone's in there." The lieutenant nodded. "Then we go wide, all the way to the stone post at the orchard's south edge. We don't cut through the middle." It added perhaps 200 yards to the approach and took them through ground that was softer and less certain underfoot. Where it also took them around the corner of the orchard to a position from which, when they finally rose and moved, they would be doing so from behind the barn, not through the trees, not across open ground, but from a blind angle that the prepared defensive positions could not reach without their crews turning completely around. Patton believed that the enemy's plan was only as strong as the assumptions beneath it. Break the assumptions, and the plan becomes a liability rather than an asset, because the men executing it have been trained to follow it, and soldiers trained to follow a plan are often slow to abandon it when the plan stops working. What Raymond and his 2 companions were about to test was whether that belief was correct. If this story means something to you, subscribing to this channel is how stories like it continue to reach the people who deserve to hear them. They moved at 5:14 in the morning, 16 minutes before the time by which headquarters needed the position confirmed. Raymond went first, then Novak, then a stocky man from Georgia named Tillman, who carried the squad's light machine gun across his back and had learned to move with it in a way that made almost no sound. The 3 of them went along the south edge of the orchard in a low crouch, moving slowly enough that they could feel the ground with each step before committing their weight to it. At the farmhouse, the candle still burned in the lower window. As they passed, wide as far as the trees allowed, Raymond could see the shadow of a figure inside moving across the light. He did not know who was in that house. He did not know what that person was praying for, or what they were afraid of, or whether they had any idea that 3 American soldiers were passing 30 yards from their wall in the dark. He hoped they were staying low. He hoped the stone of their house was thick. He did not look back. The barn's far corner was a stone pillar, perhaps 5 feet tall, that marked where the wall of the structure met the open yard on its eastern side. This was the side that faced away from the main American position, away from the main German defensive line, and toward a narrow lane that ran along the hill's eastern shoulder. When Raymond reached the pillar and pressed himself against it, he could hear, from around the barn's corner, the sounds of the German defenders. Voices, not loud, the scrape of boots, neither the mechanical sounds of weapons being reloaded or repositioned. They were occupied. Their attention was fully forward, toward the wall where the rest of the squad still lay. Raymond looked at Novak. Novak looked at Tillman. No words passed between them. They went around the corner. What happened in the next 90 seconds does not reduce to a clean narrative. What Raymond remembered of it, later and always, was not the firing or the movement, but a single moment of strange clarity. A German soldier, young, perhaps 19 years old, who was standing at the corner of the barn's open doorway, looking outward toward the wall, and who turned at the sound of Raymond's approach with an expression that was not fear, but something more precise than fear. The specific recognition that the thing he had been told was not possible was, in fact, happening. The German defensive plan had not accounted for men coming from that direction. The position there was not covered. There was a single soldier at the corner, not a prepared emplacement. And when Tillman set the machine gun on its bipod, on the flagstone floor of the barn's entrance, and opened fire inward, not across the yard toward the wall, but into the prepared positions from the rear. The effect was not the overwhelm of numbers, but the collapse of a system that had been built to face a threat from one direction and was now facing it from two. Sometime in those first seconds, Raymond was aware of a round passing close enough to him that he felt the displacement of air before he heard the sound it made. He dropped to one knee behind a wooden feeding trough and fired twice and did not look up to see the result. He was moving on instinct by then, not thought, not training in any intellectual sense, but the physical memory of 11 months of learning what to do with his body when his mind could not keep pace. The Germans turned. This was the thing that mattered, the thing Patton's principle had predicted. A force that turns to address an unexpected threat from behind must expose itself to the threat it had been prepared to handle. When the German defenders rotated toward the barn, the gap they created in the wall facing Lieutenant Cooper's squad was not large, but it was real, and the lieutenant had been watching for exactly this. The squad came over the wall. Raymond did not see this happen. He heard it. The change in the sound of the firing, the shift in its direction, the sudden decrease in pressure from his own side as the defenders divided their attention between two forces simultaneously. He kept firing, conserving rounds, choosing his moments, counting the shots remaining because he had been doing that arithmetic for 11 months, and it had become involuntary, like breathing. Novak went down. He had been moving along the barn wall when a round caught him in the thigh. He sat down against the stone with a sound that was almost ordinary, almost the sound a man makes when he has been working too hard and finally stops. Raymond got to him between firing and pressed his hand against the wound and looked at Novak's face to assess the thing that faces cannot quite hide. "It's not the big one," Novak said. He meant the artery. He was right, as it turned out, and though they didn't know that with certainty at the time. Raymond got a tourniquet on him from his own kit, the second time he had used someone else's kit in one morning, and told him to stay against the wall, and he meant it in both senses. Stay against the wall for cover, and stay against the wall because Raymond needed to know where he was. "I'm staying," Novak said. "Go." There were 2 more moments when the outcome seemed genuinely uncertain. The first was when a German non-commissioned officer, a sergeant by the look of him, older than most, with the steady deliberateness of a man who has been in this situation before, organized 4 soldiers at the far end of the barn and began moving them toward a flanking position that would have put Raymond and Tillman between 2 fires. How Raymond saw this developing across 40 feet of barn interior and made a decision that he could not fully justify in words. He moved toward the threat rather than away from it, drawing the sergeant's attention and the attention of the 4 men with him, staying low and moving laterally, behind the cover of the equipment and stalls, doing the thing the German position was not designed for, which was to be unpredictable. Tillman, without being told, moved in the opposite direction. The sergeant had to choose which American to face. He had a fraction of a second to make that choice. He chose Raymond, who was visible, and in that fraction of a second, Tillman reached the angle he needed and ended the threat with a burst of fire that emptied the last of his belt. The second near failure was quieter. It was the moment, or perhaps 15 minutes into the fight, when Raymond realized he had 2 rounds left. Not a frightening number in the abstract. 2 rounds. He set them aside in his mind and kept moving, because the only alternative to moving was to stop, and stopping was the thing that would make the 2 rounds meaningful. He did not have to use either one. At 5:31, 1 minute past the time headquarters had required, Lieutenant Cooper's voice came across the yard with the particular tone of a command that is also a question, the way a commander speaks when he believes the situation has changed but needs confirmation. "Holt, where are you?" "Here," Raymond said. He was sitting against the barn door, looking at the yard. The yard was quiet. The objective was taken. He did not know how to feel about this exactly, and the feeling was not what he would have predicted, sitting against a stone wall in Ohio and imagining what it would feel like to accomplish the thing the Army had sent him here to accomplish. It felt like the moment after a very long day of hard work when the work is finally done and you are too tired to be glad about it. There was something owed to the men across that yard, and to Frank Okafor's shoulder, and to Novak's thigh, and to all the counting and all the months that had preceded this morning. The feeling of owing something that cannot be paid is not exactly grief and not exactly satisfaction. It is something that older people understand and younger people sometimes cannot yet. The sky to the east was beginning to lighten. It had been a gray sky all week, and it was gray this morning too, and the first light it offered was colorless and flat, the kind of morning light that makes everything look equally real and equally temporary. Raymond looked at the ridgeline. Far to the north, he could hear the sound of the main crossing beginning. In the hours after the farm was secured, the men did the things that soldiers do when the fighting has stopped and the work has not yet begun. They checked their weapons and reloaded from what ammunition could be collected from the ground. They moved the wounded, Frank Okafor and Novak, to the most protected corner of the barn and made them as comfortable as the available materials permitted. They searched the position, methodically and without particular urgency, looking for documents, maps, anything that battalion intelligence would want. They drank water and ate what they had, which was not much. One man who had a pack of cigarettes passed them around without being asked, and this act, this small sharing of something that had become genuinely scarce, was noted and remembered by everyone who received one. A medic came across the river at 6:40 and attended to the wounded. He was a serious young man from Connecticut who worked quickly and spoke little, which was the right approach, and Raymond watched him work on Novak's leg, with the attention of someone who wants to know if the news is good or bad without asking for it directly. The medic caught his eye after a while and gave a small nod. It would be all right. The intelligence value of the farm position proved to be exactly what had been anticipated. American artillery observers were established there by 9 in the morning, and the fire they directed over the following 3 days disrupted the German defensive network along that section of the river in ways that opened the path for the main crossing and the advance that followed. Among the materials recovered from the German position was a set of orders and planning documents belonging to the company that had occupied it. And among those documents was a brief assessment written by the company's commander, a captain named Reinhardt, whose post-war fate Raymond never learned, composed sometime in the 48 hours before the American attack. The assessment identified the 3 most probable American approach routes and outlined the defensive response to each. It was a careful document, well-reasoned, and it reflected genuine military professionalism. It had only one significant error, which was that it did not identify the approach Raymond and his 2 companions had actually used, because that approach was, in the captain's professional judgment, tactically unsound. It exposed the attacker to the farmhouse and to rough ground with poor cover, and he had not believed any competent commander would choose it. He had been right that it was the most difficult approach. He had been wrong about whether the Americans would choose it. After the war, a German regimental history covering this section of the Moselle defense was compiled from the accounts of surviving officers. Oberst Wenger, the colonel who had written so confidently of his assessment in that September document, contributed a lengthy account of the fighting in this period. His observations about American tactical behavior are remarkable for their candor. He wrote that in his experience in Russia and in France, American forces in 1944 were unlike any enemy he had encountered in one specific respect. They did not behave predictably under pressure. Other armies, he noted, and he included German forces in this observation, which was unusual for such an account, developed patterns that experienced observers could identify and exploit. But Patton's men, particularly those who had been in the field since the summer, seemed to have absorbed a doctrine that treated predictability itself as a vulnerability. When they encountered a prepared defense, they searched for the approach the defense had not prepared for, even when that approach was harder, even when it was less safe. They were willing, he wrote, to accept additional difficulty in exchange for surprise. He had not, he acknowledged, or fully understood this before it had been demonstrated to him. General Patton received the report of the farm's capture the following morning. His response, relayed through his operations officer, was characteristically brief. "That's what we pay them for." He moved immediately to the next item on his agenda. This was, in its way, its own form of respect, the acknowledgment that his men had done the expected thing, which was to find a way when all the obvious ways had been blocked. The lesson of what happened at that farm in September of 1944 is not primarily a lesson about military tactics, though it is that too. It is a lesson about the relationship between preparation and surprise, and about which of those two things ultimately matters more when the moment of real difficulty arrives. The German defenders had prepared thoroughly, and they had studied the ground. They had analyzed the most likely approach routes. They had positioned their forces with intelligence and care, and they had been confident in the result of their analysis, because their analysis was not wrong. It was simply incomplete in the one specific way that mattered. It assumed that the Americans, facing those prepared positions, would choose one of the approaches that had been prepared for. What the German position could not account for was men who had been taught to distrust the obvious path, who had learned through months of hard and costly experience that the approach the enemy has covered is the approach you should not take, and that the approach the enemy has not covered, even if it is harder, even if it is more exposed in some ways, even if it violates the logic of the training manual, is precisely the one that offers the possibility of surprise. Patton built an army that was, in an important sense, organized around this idea, not just in the grand strategic movements for which his campaigns are remembered, but in the smallest tactical choices made by the smallest units, in the dark, under fire, when there was no time to radio headquarters and no possibility of waiting for a cleaner situation. He built an army that could think when thinking was the only weapon left. There is something in this that belongs to more than the history of one campaign in one war. Anyone who has lived long enough, and everyone who is listening to this story has lived long enough, knows the experience of encountering an obstacle that seems to cover every obvious approach, the door that will not open, the problem that will not yield, the situation that appears to have no good answer, and knows, too, that the mind that has been trained to look for the one approach the obstacle has not prepared for, that is not giving up, and it is not being reckless. It is doing the most disciplined thing available to it. Raymond Holt went home to Waverly, Ohio, in the spring of 1945. He went back to working at the hardware store alongside his father, and eventually took it over when his father's health declined. He married a woman named Patricia, who had grown up 3 streets over, and they had 3 children. He did not talk about the war very much, not because he was unwilling, but because he had found, as many of his generation did, that the things that were most important about it were also the things most resistant to easy description. You had to have been against a stone wall in the dark, counting your rounds, to fully understand why 2 rounds, in the right circumstances, might be exactly enough. He died in 1989. His name is not on a national memorial. He never received a decoration beyond what was routine for a combat infantryman of his service. He was, by the measure of public recognition, an ordinary man. But in the records of his division, in the intelligence documents of his enemies, and in the artillery observer's log that recorded the first fire missions, directed from the farm above the Moselle River on the morning of September 14th, 1944, there is evidence of what he and his companions did on a morning when everything was harder than anyone had promised it would be, and they did it anyway. The farm still stands. The stone walls are still there. The orchard, somewhat grown in now, is still on the south side. If you were to walk that ground today, and if you knew where to look, you could find the corner of the barn, where the pillar marks the edge of the old wall, and you could stand there in whatever light the day offered, and you could think about what it costs to choose the harder path, and why, sometimes, it is the only path that leads anywhere worth going. If someone in your family served in this theater of the war, or in any theater, I would be honored to read about it in the comments. Their name, their unit, if you know it, where they were. These are the stories that deserve to be remembered.